Okay, so the Russian Revolution. Your questions here are: why did the March Revolution occur? Who were the two new agencies in charge after Tsar Nicholas leaves his throne? And how did Lenin play a role in changing Russia? So let's go ahead and get started with the March Revolution. So, what the March Revolution was, the Great War had undermined the Russian state and it put them in a position they didn't expect to be in because it weakened them. And Tsar Nicholas will essentially abdicate his throne due to mutinies, food shortages, uprisings that he could not suppress. So, pretty much, he lost control of his country, is what happens. And so, Russia will no longer be a dynasty under the Romanov dynasty. And this will be the first of two revolutions. So, who's in charge then? The struggle for power. After the revolution's success, it will move the country. Um, there's going to be two new agencies who are going to be in charge. One will be the provisional government, and the other will be the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. So, the workers and soldiers deputies, they had a lot of power, especially in factories and parts of the military, because that's where a lot of their support came from. The political struggle between the provisional government and the workers and soldiers and deputies was existing there because um, the people were not getting what they wanted from the provisional government. So the provisional government could not meet their needs and demands of an end to a war and land reform. The provisional government would pledge to stay true to the Allies, and the Petrograd said, you know what, no, we want peace and we need more support. So there was that struggle for power. We need to stay in the war and we need to, be loyal to what we said. And then at the other end, we see the Petrograd saying, no, we need to worry and focus on us. So this creates a door for Lenin to come into. So Vladimir Lenin was a revolutionary Marxist. He felt that industrial working class didn't have the conscientious capability to make political changes, and he felt that industrial workers needed help to organize and get their revolution progressing to realize a socialist society. So he said, pretty much he's saying, you need help. You need me, essentially. So Lenin became the leader of the Bolsheviks, and he called for a transfer of legal authority to the Soviet Party. So pretty much get rid of that provisional government and just let, the Soviet Party be in charge. And he was opposed to the war. All right, so your next questions here, 23 and 24. What will the November Revolution accomplish, and what was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk? So the November Revolution, this is the second revolution. The Bolsheviks will get control of the Petrograd Soviets, and the provisional government couldn't meet the demands of the people, so they will pretty much let go of any control. And the people felt the problems could only be resolved by the Soviets. So again, they will probably let go. All power to the Soviets, peace, land, and bread were their slogans to kind of promote themselves, and the Bolsheviks will have an armed insurrection and seize power in the name of all Russian National Congress of the Soviets. And again, by this time, the provisional government, by November 7th, the power had passed from the provisional government to Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. So this was an armed insurrection, and the provisional government is gone, and now Lenin and the Bolshevik Party are in charge. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So the treaty, essentially what it was that it was going to end the involvement of Russia in the war. It's going to give Germany possession of some of the Russian territories, and leaving the war allowed the Russians to deal with the internal problems because they felt that by them being in the war, it was not resolving anything internally. And this also meant that Germany could concentrate on the Western Front. So now there's only a one-front war instead of a two-front war. All right, the U.S. intervention and collapse of Central Powers. We see the economic considerations. Your question here, what were the U.S. reasons for entering the war? Okay, so as the U.S. is coming into the war, we're going to see the collapse of the Central Powers. So your question is, what were the U.S. reasons for entering into the war? We have economic considerations here. So the first 2 years of the war, the U.S. was in a recession. So 15% unemployment the first 2 years of the war for the U.S. The economic recovery depended a lot on the war materials being produced, and allies took loans from American banks. A lot of the allies borrowed money from them, especially money from banks that were of Jewish descent. So the Allied victory and paying off war debts could have only been done by the U.S. entering the war. That's the only way that this could have happened if the U.S. had entered. So submarine warfare, the main reason for the U.S. entering in the war was unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans. Um, the Germans, for them, this is the way of tightening this is the way of tightening of Great Britain economically. So what these submarine warfares did was, because at first they tried to stop Great Britain's ships from going in by just doing a blockade. That didn't work. So then they took it a step further and said any ships that enter within, this vicinity of the sea, were going to be shot at. Doesn't matter who it was. It was unrestricted. So attacking all Great Britain ships would end the war in 6 months. That's the thought of it. So Germans sank neutral ships without warning, and one of the ships that they sank was the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship. So it wasn't even a war ship at all. And 128 of the people who were on this ship were U.S. civilians, and they were on board the ship at the time. So the U.S. tone toward Germany definitely changed once they found out that there were U.S. citizens on that ship. So some opposition to entering the war, but in April 6, 1917, the U.S. declares war on Germany. The other thing that also, besides this unrestricted submarine warfare, was also something called the Zimmermann telegram. And essentially what this telegram was a telegram to Germany that got intercepted by the U.S. But what it said was, and this was a telegram from Germany to Mexico that got intercepted by the United States. And what the telegram said was that if Mexico helped to, fight the United States, if Mexico helped to fight against the United States in World War I, then at the end of World War I, when Germany and the rest of them won, then that Mexico could go ahead and get back the lands that the U.S. took from them, okay? The Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California lands. So the U.S. found out about this little telegram, and that was, something in addition to make them join the war as well. So the U.S. intervention still here. The collapse of the fronts. So 26, how did Germany finally lose the war? So the war had been taking a toll on many nations, especially the nations that had been in the war since the beginning, since 1914. Okay, the U.S. comes in at the tail end of the war. So they had fresh troops, they had fresh resources, and that really helps them. We see the Easter Rebellion, and what this was Irish attempt to overthrow British rule. Didn't necessarily work out, but the Central Powers will suffer food shortages due to the British blockading them. And the Germany made a final attempt to throw all its power on the Western Front, but it didn't work out for them, and they essentially would lose because the Allies would begin to start pushing them back. So pretty much Germany had no more power to fight. And by November 11th, 1918, the Germans will accept an armistice, and they will, pretty much end, and it will pretty much end the war. So what happens after the war? So questions 27 and 28. 27, what happened in the Paris settlement? And 28, what was a part of Wilson's 14 points? So during this time, even at the end of the war, after the war, we see an influenza pandemic of 1918. And this is also known as the Spanish flu. And due in the first place to where it was located in Spain and documented. So the war did not cause the flu, but led to its spread. So during the war, as people were getting sick and fighting in these areas, they made the flu spread, and it spread to the point where it was a pandemic. and there was no cure for the flu. Obviously, there's still no cure for the flu, but it didn't help that the war spread it everywhere. So, the Paris settlement. After the war, there were a lot of concessions made, especially by the losing party, on what they were going to do, especially by Germany. So the victorious powers, they got together to arrange post-settlement and set terms for defeated nations. So pretty much it's like the winners getting together and deciding this is what's going to happen to the losers. So the Central Powers did not participate in this, and this is going to be, this is going to hurt them, and they're not going to forget that they were not a part of this. So the Allies threatened to start war again if the terms were not accepted. So some of the terms that we see in World War I was that the Germans were going to give up certain lands, especially the Rhineland. The Germans were going to admit it was their fault for starting the war. And the Germans are also going to pay for all the damages, all the reparations of the war. So the Germans were the ones that got hit the hardest after World War I. And it's really going to take a toll on them, and it's really going to be something that is going to be used to start this kind of nationalistic ideology that we see Hitler use to kind of gain support for his political motives. So Wilson's 14 points. After the post-war peace settlement, Woodrow Wilson, who was the United States president at the time, wanted to come up with something. So he came up with something called the 14 points. And what this included was pretty much almost trying to have a sort of peace agreement with the world, saying that there was freedom of the seas, that there's a removal of economic barriers, trade conditions, reduction of armament. All of this was a part of the 14 points. The idea was moral leadership among allies. And some allies opposed this because they had already made secret agreements after the war about, economic activity, about political activity, that kind of thing. So it's something that he wanted to push, but it didn't necessarily work, and it wasn't effective. Also, after the war, we see some peace treaties. So question 29, what did the Treaty of Versailles do, and what did the Treaty of Sèvres do? 30, what did Ataturk accomplish? And 31, what were the two drawbacks of the League of Nations? So the Treaty of Versailles, we kind of just said already how Germany was the one that suffered the most, and it was through this Treaty of Versailles where they had to do all these things. They were denied a Navy and an Air Force. They had to reduce their army, like I said already. They had to pay for reparations of the war, and they had to admit it was their fault, and they had to give up land. All of this was under the Treaty of Versailles. In addition, we see the Treaty of Sèvres, and pretty much what this treaty did was it officially dissolved the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was no more, which made it available for these nationalist aspirations to rise and create countries. So Serbia could be a country, Czechoslovakia, that kind of thing. So Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal, also known as Ataturk, was the father of the Turks. He came up with a program of modernization, and he emphasized economic development and secularism, the idea that we need to shift from just being a Turkish religious group or people to something that's more connected with the world. So he said there should be a separation between Muslim establishments and the state, similar to what you see in Western democracy, the idea of separation of church and state. And Ataturk ruled as a dictator. The League of Nations. So the League of Nations would hope to avoid, this was the creation, it's kind of like the pre-United Nations, okay? Almost like this kind of group of different countries getting together to, again, create peace. And the League of Nations was created in hopes to avoid future conflicts, and the mission was to maintain world peace, and every part of the peace treaty everyone who was a part of the peace treaty had to agree to this. So there were two flaws in this. One, there's no power to enforce decisions, And it relied on collective security as a tool for global peace, meaning everybody had to be in agreement. The U.S. never joined because the Senate rejected this idea. They didn't feel that it was logical to be a part of this. So the League of Nations, like I said, would serve as a precursor to the United Nations. And again, you need to think of how different is this from the United Nations? I mean, the United Nations is not there to create war, it's there to maintain peace. So, in what way can they establish power? And probably the biggest difference here is that the United Nations can implement sanctions on countries that are not adhering to the rules of the organization. Also, after the war, we see some more self determination, but we also see a mandate system in place. So, questions 32 and 33. 32, what were some drawbacks of self determination? And 33, how did the mandate system work? So, self determination was part of the peacemaking process, and Wilson believed in self determination. He said this was the key to peace, that we should allow these ethnicities to determine how they want to rule and determine if they want to be their own countries. So diplomats sometimes they couldn't support this. They found it hard because they said it was difficult to redraw boundaries without creating minorities on either side of the boundary, meaning that if we create a new map and we break a part of this map up, like right here in this area, then some people who are not all completely, let's say, Muslim, and they're more Jewish, they're going to be suffering in a predominantly Muslim land. So a lot of people had a hard time with this. The mandate system. So peacemakers applied self-determination and nationality throughout Europe. So the U.S. did not like the idea of colonies. So Europe came up with with the idea of a trusteeship. Okay, and this came from this, and this was essentially the mandate system. So mandates came in three forms depending on population size and fitness of self-determination. So essentially, it's like little brother, big brother. Okay, and the big brother are the already established European countries or the United States. And then like the little brother is like the country, or the area that wants to become a country. So Germans saw this mandate system as dividing colonial booty. The Germans said, this isn't fair. You're just breaking up our land that we had. I mean, given they lost it, but that's still what they felt like. And Arabs were outraged by the system too because they felt they could create their own countries. They didn't need to be watched over. They didn't need to have like a big brother watching over them. So where Arabs wanted to create independent states, the French established mandates. So again, that larger, stronger country that won in World War I is now looking after, a smaller state that it's not a full-fledged country yet. So the Allies saw it as a compromise between imperialism and self-determination, meaning that we're not going to take total control over you, but we're going to let you try to figure out things, but we're still watching what you're doing. All right, so challenges to European preeminence. Weakened Europe. Question 34, what was the major change that occurred because Europe was weakened after the war? And question 35, what did the war do for people living in the colonies? So the decline in European power was due to a decline in the economy because of the total war. So after World War I ended, Europe was in a real bad place economically. They borrowed money from the U.S. They really didn't know how to pay it. So economic problems included high inflation, public debt, loss of overseas investment, and foreign markets as well. And there was a huge change, reversal of economic relationship between Europe and the U.S. Before, it was the U.S. depending on Europe. And now it's Europe depending on the U.S. to help them. And because of this, the U.S. became a creditor nation, meaning the U.S. said, yeah, we can help you out. We can give you loans. We can, give money to you. And this was really going to make the U.S. become a superpower. So the revolutionary ideas that stem from World War I, the war spread revolutionary ideas to colonies. They also spread it to Russia as well. They promoted national aspirations in the colonies as well. Other colonies saw this. They said, hey, if they can do it, maybe we can try also. And the concept of self-determination and self-rule grew and held strong despite post-war setbacks. Again, the idea that if these little areas that were once controlled got help, got freedom, and were helped by these larger countries, then maybe we can get our own freedom too. All right, so I know this was an absolutely long screencast. It was broken up into two sections, and they were both really long. I'm sorry, but it's World War I. It's super important that you know the causes, what happened during, and the effects. So make sure you understand it fairly well, and we will see you next time.